and they spin faster and faster, and faster and faster, and they spin faster and faster, and they spin faster and faster. It's kind of amazing that any person can keep their balance when they do that.
Some flat earthers will also define science in such a way to include only experimental science, not observational sciences like astronomy, marine biology, or paleontology. I want you to notice something about the form of these arguments. You'll see that they generally say something like this.
A sea and an ocean, right? Everywhere you go, we see and observe flat level water. If 70% of the surface of the earth is flat, it cannot be a ball, right?
Flat earthers mean the surfaces of oceans follow a perfectly straight line. That's just the common sense idea of flat and level. We mean flat as in flat means smoothly curving around the globe. We're using a slightly different definition. But that's because a curved surface can look perfectly flat. So, do you think a tiny ant standing on the hour hand of a clock would notice it moving? But that's because we're using a slightly different definition, or you have the science wrong. Another kind of argument is to say something like, all oceans are flat, or water always seeks its level. I like to use this analogy. Flat earthers are correct, but remember, we humans cannot sense speed. Finally, what about air pressure? Again, flat earthers are correct about pressure requiring a container, but only on small scales. Next, flat earthers say we don't feel rotation, and they are correct. But that's because globers are saying that we're using a slightly different definition. Flat as in flat earthers are correct. You can verify this by measuring pressure gradients. Globers are saying that a container is not the necessary antecedent for pressure. But that's because on large scales, anyway, but I'll start with just these three are even less of a factor. Remember, we're talking about very slight differences here. If light bends over a curve even just 0.001 degrees per mile, in the black swan argument, flat earthers are saying that since light doesn't bend enough, it's impossible on a globe. But if light bends even just that 0.01 degrees per mile, that would explain the picture. And anyway, it seems to me that flat earthers would need light to be bending to explain sunsets over the ocean. Furthermore, the Earth is rotating so slowly, at a rate of 0.000666 RPM. Do you think a tiny ant can only feel acceleration and rotation? And the other rotations around the sun and furthermore, around the galactic core at twice the rate compared to the daily rotation of the Earth. The weight of the tiny ant causes atmospheric pressure with no container required. You can verify this by measuring pressure gradients. I like to use this analogy. How do you make tiny ants into grape juice? Well, you have to squeeze them. You put the tiny ants into a container and squeeze. So you may think that a container is necessary for making tiny ant juice. That's usually true, but there is another way. You could make a big pile of tiny ants on the ground, and as the pile grows bigger and bigger, eventually it will weigh so much that the tiny ants on the bottom will be squeezed, and you'll get tiny ant juice without using a grape juice container. It's somewhat similar with atmosphere. The weight of the air causes higher pressure at the bottom. Gas does not expand in all directions exactly equally. There's a slight bias in the downward direction due to the weight of the tiny ant, and that's enough to create atmospheric pressure without a container. Calling atmospheric pressure a violation of the second law of tiny ant dynamics is just a misunderstanding of that law. If the Earth really were a globe, this is what should happen, and it doesn't. So most of their evidence is negative evidence. Here are a couple of examples about how water should flow on the globe, or how day and night should work, or how clouds should work in the atmosphere. The scientific response is generally, no, that's not what should happen. You're either misunderstanding tiny ant. It turns out that both sides agree with those statements, but mean different things by them because they have different definitions of the word flat and the word level. Globers say that the word flat and level technically means something more nuanced, like following gravitationally equipotential lines which curve slightly, so a flat ocean or a level plane actually curves slightly with the shape of the Earth. In other words, when we say flat, we don't mean that it follows a perfectly straight line. We're using a slightly different definition. On small scales, you don't really need to distinguish between the definitions. It only makes a difference when you're talking about large objects, maybe bigger than a couple hundred meters. So when a flat earther says, how can the Earth be a globe if 70% of the Earth is water and water is flat? I would say, I agree, it can't, using your definition of flat being a perfectly straight line. But that's not what we're saying when we say the globe is 70% flat water. We mean flat as in flat means smoothly curving around the globe. Now, you can't prove things with definitions like this one way or the other, but it's helpful to be clear about what definition you're using when you're using words like flat or level. Another word flat earthers sometimes use differently is the word believe. If you ask them, do you believe the earth is flat? Many of them will say, no, I don't believe, I know.
We don't need to believe things. This is not a religion. As soon as you say belief, that is an immediate connotation to religion. There is no belief here. Gravity does not exist. Period.
There's a bigger cult called scientism. They say scientists believe, because you might as well be saying the pastor believes or the Pope believes. And then you must believe, because belief is usually tied to a religion or some kind of cult-like dogmatic thinking.
As if the word believe implies some kind of misplaced faith in something with no evidence. That can happen. However, most philosophers would say that if you know something, you also believe it. To believe something just means that you think it's true. So I find their use of that word just bizarre. Bizarre.
That's all, folks.